You know, back in the day, as we say, and I'm literally talking about 30 and 40 years ago when I was starting this, people weren't as shy around you. There weren't everybody taking pictures like they are now. Don't forget, nowadays we have wonderful cameras built into our cell phones, so we all are used to people taking pictures of things all around. Now people are actually objecting more. You know, there are a lot of people who just don't want to be photographed because it is what allowed me to go and take these pictures. So I would tell you right now that today's world is a much harder world to try and take photographs in, I think, than it was back then. Well, I graduated from RIT in 1969, and then in late August, this news of this massive hurricane, the biggest hurricane at that time that had ever been recorded, the lowest air pressure ever recorded for a hurricane. I was told that I could move on the story, meaning go on in on the story, if there was 4 deaths. I'm from South Louisiana. I've gone through so many hurricanes. 4 deaths is almost, you know, an absolute.
What was once Hurricane Camille has now moved into the Mississippi Delta north of Jackson. In her wake, she left at least 22 persons dead in Mississippi and in Louisiana.
And I was with the first crew of the National Guard that crossed the Bay St. Louis Bridge into the Gulf Coast. And sure enough, we start photographing recovery of bodies. And that's a hard thing for anybody to deal with. This was my first national and international assignment. And sure enough, the second place we come across, they recover a headless body. But it's even worse than that. Part of the crew that was recovering this body was the nephew of this woman. And as I'm coming up to take photographs, he came down carrying the body. And of course, he confronted me right away. What are you doing? Why are you here? What are you doing taking pictures here? And the only thing I could think of was, I'm here to shoot these pictures of bodies that you're recovering because people didn't pay attention that they should get out when there's a hurricane. And he turned around to me and said, thanks. This means that there'll be some validity to, you know, his aunt's death, that there was good reason for it. If I had not gotten that reply, I don't know if I could have gone on into the rest of my photojournalism career.
The sights to be seen after this unbelievable storm are in themselves unbelievable. Rubble, litter, devastation everywhere.
You know, the picture of Steve Jobs was taken at something called the Comdex, which is the computer industry show. So Steve Jobs introduces this little rectangular box that almost everybody could buy, and you could take it around with you. It was only black and white, by the way. There was no color to it yet. Mind you, Hewlett-Packard, IBM, they all had new products out there. But this caught the audience's eye. You should have seen what happened. It almost emptied everything else that was going on and brought everybody to that one stage where he was introducing this.
I'd like to let Macintosh speak for itself.
Hello, I am Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag.
It was so radical. It was so intuitive. They'd never had that. It was the first mouse. It was the mouse that had brought Apple to the forefront. That literally is the thing that helped them probably more than anything else. And then that intuitiveness of working on a Mac. So the Steve Jobs that we know now, the guy who always wore black and always wore the sweaters and stuff like that, he was just this little young kid introducing his homemade computer. So the photograph called Flags at a Football Game is an interesting picture because there was another picture taken at the same football game that has won me all sorts of praise, okay? And it was a picture of Archie Manning, Peyton and Eli's daddy, okay? But one of the things that I noticed when I got there was when the football team came in, it was nothing but a sea of stars and bars. This was in 1969. Things should have changed by then. At that time, having nothing but a sea of Confederate flags was really offensive. It was really offensive to the black players. It was really offensive to those people who wanted to support University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. But I like to show that image because I want to show how radically different it was just as late as 1969. Well, on the picture of Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple, that's what probably most people know her for, the movie and everything. I had to photograph her in Jackson, Mississippi. This was during the height of the Civil Rights era. A white guy going to photograph a black woman in Mississippi was not something you did. So it was set up where I had to go to a phone booth, call a number, then they'd tell me to go somewhere else, and I'd call a number. Then they'd say, okay, she'll meet you in 5 minutes. And so she came by and picked me up, and we went to her house. Now you have to understand, not only is she an activist poet at that time and also novelist, but she was married to a white guy. She was married to a Jewish white guy, Mel Leventhal. And by the way, a few weeks later, I was supposed to drive her up to a place called Mound Bayou, Mississippi, which was set up by Jefferson Davis as an all-black community. I was supposed to drive her up there, and I had to tell the editors at the New York Times, don't think I'm a bigot, but I can't drive her. So she went in another car with a couple of people, and I was following her up. And as I came into Mound Bayou, I saw the Mississippi State Trooper who was standing on the sideline, double-handed, holding his .357 Magnum. And he put 3 shots into my car. Now, being a freelance photojournalist, I didn't have the insurance to pay for that. So when I took the car up to Memphis, I left it way in the back of the parking lot and got on my plane, you know. About 2 months later, I got this little notice from Hertz saying, hey, did you know that your car was shot up? I expressed complete surprise over this. It must have happened in the parking lot, you know. Well, you know, I've got 2 photographs in there from Angola Prison, of all things, my favorite prison in the state of Louisiana. It's a horrible place, and it's always being reported as you know, one of the worst prisons in the United States. Being young and stupid, I broke into the prison, okay? I had heard through the ACLU about this 15-year-old kid who was convicted of murder and sentenced to death row, 15 years old. So we drive on up to Angola and we tell the guards that we're there to photograph the warden. There's not a guard in the world that won't stop you if you're going to go photograph the warden for a nice story on the warden. So they come on through. And as we're walking, I said, well, anybody know about this guy, Johnny Ross? Oh, yeah, he's on death row. I said, little bitty kid, huh? I said, oh, yeah, I'd like to get a picture of him. And they said, well, he's on death row. I said, well, you know, if I'm going to photograph the warden, I'm sure he would let me go there. Okay. So they bought it. And so all of a sudden, I'm on death row, and we open up the door. He's not there. The kid who was convicted of murder and is supposed to be sitting on death row is not there. You know what happens next? The guard turns to the other guard and says, anybody seen Johnny Ross? I said, oh, well, he's down in detention, solitary confinement. He acted up. So naturally, I said, well, let's go down solitary confinement and see what's happening, you know. I'll be damned if the guard didn't take me down to solitary confinement. So when he opened up the door, what you saw is, in this picture, was shot with an extremely wide-angle lens. But I want to show you all something. I suspect that if you look at that photograph, you really only count 3 people right away. Take a look all the way down at the bottom of that image. The convict who had asthma was allowed to sleep on the floor right next to where the jail cell closed so that he could breathe that little bit of fresh air. The other convicts had seen to it that at least he got to get fresh air. Now, the other picture I shot that you'll see from Angola is of Wilbert Rideau. At age 17, he had held up a bank, took 3 hostages, and killed 2 of them. Tried to kill the 3rd one, but she survived. So she testified, obviously, against him, and so that's why he was convicted of a heinous couple of murders. I mean, this guy was a bad, bad person. In incarceration, he got his education, and he learned how to write, and he learned how to write from the essence. In other words, he wrote about real things that really did happen. We first got wind of him, like I said, through the ACLU because we got one of the copies of his magazine. My first question to him is, how did you get this magazine printed? He said, printed? I would break into the warden's office and run it off on a mimeograph machine. He said we would smuggle it by putting it into our pants legs. And then when we would have conjugal visits or just visits from family and stuff, we'd smuggle them out. So I confronted the warden at that time. I said, well, listen, you know, this guy's really good at what he does. I said, I'm no real judge of writing it or anything, but to have that initiative to not break out of jail, but rather break into the warden's office so he could run off mimeograph of his writings, I said, that's pretty neat. I said, as a New York Times photographer, is it okay for me to donate anything to him? He said, oh yeah, you can donate. And he picked the IBM Selectric because it was the most expensive typewriter you could get at the time. He said, if you donated an IBM Selectric to him, I'll let him have a desk where he can sit and write. I donated an IBM Selectric, okay? And about 5 to 10 years later, he won the Robert Kennedy Journalism Award as Best Journalist of the Year. This is a guy who's incarcerated. He's sitting in jail. He smuggled out his own writings and got such acclaim from his writings that he was later allowed to go on field trips. This is a lifer, okay? Allowed to go on field trips to teach symposiums on writing. I saw Wilbert about 5 years ago. He got out of prison. He had served 43 years of a life sentence, one of the longest sentences ever served in prison. And now he's out and he does nothing but write about prisons and the inequities and the things that are going on wrong. So this is a guy who had no possibilities of improvement in his life. He was as poor, and he was a black man. He had no education, and he was able to rehabilitate himself. Now let me say one more thing about Johnny Ross. Johnny Ross was just let go 5 years ago when they discovered that the information used at the trial, the forensic information, had been falsified. This kid had served from 15 until he was 55 on false charges. They were going to hang him. This guy was proven to be innocent. How many other people who had been convicted of things like that have gone and suffered the ultimate price, gone and lost their lives, that could have maybe have not been convicted? So Johnny Ross is a great story about the wrongness of prison, and Wilbert Rideau is a real good example to me of the rightness of prison, that he took it and rather than become worse, became better, become very educated, and became this incredible writer. So one of the things about working for the New York Times was they sent me on wonderful assignments. And when I was doing some coverage in Central America, we were covering the Guatemala elections. And so all of a sudden we got this information about a presidential candidate that was going to go to this, of all things, Judas worshiping ceremony. It's called Mashimon in the native language. It was up in a little small village up in the mountains. And so what I did was got myself a guide, and I said, okay, we need to go see this. So this little community got together and got to thinking that Catholicism constantly teaches that you should pray for those people who've had bad things happen to them, right? Who's the worst person that you could think of in the Bible? Well, they started figuring out it was Judas. He had betrayed Jesus, right? So he had to be the worst person. So they would pray to Judas for his well-being. To, you know, everybody gets to be protected, you know, by prayer and stuff. Now in the photograph, you'll see on the upper left-hand side is the minister, and he's just high as a kite on peyote. He was just chewing and throwing up all the time, right? But if you notice in the body of the picture, there's two, I would call them dummies, one sort of larger one and then one smaller one. And those were the things that you had to go and pray to, and you had to kiss the hand of the glove, okay? Well, they made me do that, and as soon as I kissed that hand of the glove, I was so ill it wasn't even funny. It was like, from what I read, it's like being on an acid trip. So, I'm stuck here in this damn little village, high as a kite, waiting for a presidential candidate to come on in, and I'll be damned if he didn't come on in and start lighting black candles, which are ill will, right, against the other people who are running. I got out of there as soon as I could, but I swear to you that that little village and the other village that it shared is the only place I've ever heard of that has a Judas worshiping ceremony. So the photograph that shows Dr. Alton Ochsner holding up two lungs, one diseased and one okay, and you can tell which one is diseased. And so I was photographing him, and I said, well, you know, you're known for many, many things. You're a fantastic heart surgeon, fantastic professor who has taught this to so many surgeons. I said, what is it that you want to be known for? And he said, come with me down to the lab. Labs at hospitals are scary to me already, you know. So I go down to the lab, and he says, look, hold this. And he hands me a lung. And it was heavy. It was heavier than you would think. Then he hands me a normal lung, and it was like styrofoam. And I'm thinking, wow, what's the difference? He says, you know what's wrong with that bad one? I said, well, it's very discolored and stuff. He says, that's from smoking. That was the actual lung that he had used in his paper. So he was the first person to actually hit that point where it was acclaimed and acknowledged through proper research that cigarette smoking would lead or could lead to cancer. These things still go on. That's the reason why I took these photographs, to document that. Most people don't know that that still goes on. If we don't continue to show these kinds of civil rights violations, these kinds of harsh conditions that you make a child live in, if we don't show that, we can't advance as a culture. It's real, it's there, I document it. Or I did it for my 25 years before I came into teaching as a profession. I went back to the University of Alabama Roll Tide, got my master's degree so I could come on in to teach. I understood that I knew something that was valuable to try to pass on. I want to excite my students about what the possibilities are that they can do. You know, this whole idea that you're making a documentary of me is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. Not that people will necessarily fall over themselves over my photographs, but that they will understand that they have that right. And I would say that conviction that they can go on out and just document the world, let people see what it is, and make their own decisions.